have great possibilities of emerging stronger. But the question is, how will we deepen this cooperation? How will especially the more developed nations respond to this crisis? Will there be that greater understanding that we are stronger together than apart? These are some of the critical questions that one must continue to ask. Because, for example, if I was to look at how we responded as an African continent under the auspices of the African Union, we were very, very closely knit in terms of our reaction, the actions that we took, how we cooperated in developing and coming up with this COVAX scheme to ensure that vaccines were going to be available not to one particular country. We came up with a joint effort and we said we want a solution for the entire continent. And really that was actually the crux and the beginning of the whole COVAX scheme and how it came to be. But like I said, at the end of the day, when the vaccine was actually finally developed, those who developed and had it were not willing to share it with the rest of the world. And that is why I keep, and I want to consistently reiterate, that it will really depend on us being able to change the global governance system, the manner in which the UN Security Council works, the manner in which the UN and its organizations work, in order for us to be able to determine whether we shall see a change. Here we are, struggling on the one hand, not just with the direct problems that have been caused by the virus, but also suffering through with unemployment, many jobs lost because supply chains have been disrupted, a lot of our young people unemployed, but yet at the same time, we are struggling with survival between keeping our people economically stable and floating, and at the same time struggling to pay our debt. Now, when we come across to the World Bank and the IMF, we see great determination on their part, but we still haven't seen the willingness, for example, even in terms of the IMF granting the extra funds required, and yet developed worlds have sufficient funds, have been able from within their own resources to generate subsidies to support and to provide safety nets for their people who have been unemployed, and we, on the other hand, are left struggling. So these are some of the issues that we're going to start to say. Is it going to be about the G7, the G20? Is it going to be about the P5? Or is it going to be about the fact that every single nation in this globe matters and their point of view needs to be listened to? And that's why in Africa we are focused ourselves as what we call the C10, to see how we can push through this agenda of creating and pushing for reforms within the United Nations agencies in order for us to be able to have an equal say in matters that concern us. What this pandemic has actually shown is that we need more cooperation, not less cooperation. It has shown the importance of our multilateral institutions, but at the same time it has shown that you cannot win unless everybody wins. And I think the bottom line is, for the first time, many African countries were actually very much on the forefront of doing and following the kind of guidelines that had been laid out. We were also very active in the very early stages, participating with a lot of the companies and corporations that were developing vaccines, participating in the clinical trials. But unfortunately, despite our preparations, when it came to the crunch, and the crunch was access to the very same vaccines that would have given us all protection, we were at the bottom of the list. Now, this is something that truly indicates that the kind of vaccine, kind of nationalism that we have seen, the kind of bias that you have seen in terms of hoarding critical vaccines, where you have countries today that have 50 vaccines to every citizen, and yet you have countries that are crying just to give their citizens a single dose. I think this kind of thing actually shows that we really need to deepen cooperation, and not just cooperation in terms of the global financial situation, but in terms of all actions that we take. If it's climate change doesn't affect one country as opposed to another. It affects the globe. If it's the world financial situation, it affects the globe. So we need to have a greater cooperation, greater participation, and I believe that's why forums like this become much more important. And I couldn't agree more than what President Erdogan said here in his opening statement when he said that we need our multilateral institutions to be much more representative of the global population as opposed to the interests of a few. This particular forum comes at a very apt time, a time when every part of the world is feeling the impact of a global crisis, and a growing realization that no single party has the capacity to overcome this crisis without all of us working together. I want to agree with the President of Kosovo that this is not really a time for recrimination or pointing fingers. But we really have to accept also that we have seen that the global governance system isn't actually working equitably and fairly for all global citizens. And I think it just draws us to the reality that we have a challenge, and that challenge can only be overcome if we democratize much more our global governance systems, if we are more inclusive in our decision-making process. Like I said, if at a difficult time like this, when you're dealing both with a health crisis but also an economic crisis, where you have multilateral institutions who I believe are doing their very best, but are dependent on the largest contributors. And when you have the IMF, for example, say they are willing to look at increasing the SDR allocation to the developing world, but that therefore requires the bigger contributors to accept. Now, these bigger contributors are already enjoying great stimulus packages for their citizens, but yet they're not willing to release these SDRs in order to help the less developed world. I think that is not equity in global solutions. We need to find greater equity in global governance in order to be able to ensure that we live in a fair, equitable world where we all take responsibility, and like my brother Moisa said, where we all swim together, because the other option, on the other hand, is that we all sink together.
Mr. Borrell mentioned the COVAX initiative, to which we as Kosovo have also benefited. But while we were benefiting from it, we were seeing that not every single time was the distribution equitable. So I think it's very important that important criteria are respected every single time, and not only at times, so that the lessons that we have learned from this very difficult situation throughout the world also include one that will make the rest of the world that is much more stronger, that can help those of us that are not that strong, that equitability and a just support is extremely important. Those who need more help should receive more help. And when we talk about how we can never be safe unless everyone is safe, let's make sure that this principle is used also for other global challenges, not just for the pandemic. These are times of constant threats because of terrorism, because of cyber attacks, because of the way the climate is changing. We need to make sure that when we talk about climate change, environment, we also use that same principle that no one is safe unless everyone is safe. So struggles with climate change in the Maldives are something that we should understand will be affecting us all one day. At the same time, when we think about the future, and this is the same for everyone, countries big or small, poor or wealthy, we need to see a future that is inspired by innovation and digitalization. I think this is the time when we must understand that not just development, but also survival of pandemics like this will be dependent on how much we understand that equitable help, digitalization, innovation, and a much greener future from the one that we've seen so far are the way forward. Because otherwise, if we talk, but we never walk the talk, obviously the challenges will be immense in the future as well.
Diplomacy is an area upon which we've been exercising ever since the dawning of time. It has been a vessel, it has been an instrument that has been in use dating back to many ages. Diplomacy set the balance between peace and war times all throughout history, and it has always been a preventive instrument, gaining even more significance and prominence. Communication technologies, internet, social media, and ever-increasing globalization led to the expansion of the circle of influence of diplomacy more and more. When we name-drop diplomacy today, we're not just talking about the deliberations between state and government officials behind closed doors. With this concept, we are referring to the public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy, as well as tourism diplomacy and trade diplomacy. We are trying to refer to the exercises and practices taking place on a vast spectrum. The platforms upon which diplomacy is being exercised are becoming more diverse, as well as the political actors. Along with the politicians and the diplomats, the NGOs, the global business media, and universities are molding the foreign policies of the nations. Digital diplomacy is becoming more and more prominent in this day and age, and it is one of the most fundamental gains of this new era. In this day and age, an effective diplomacy requires you to have a wide perspective while assessing situations and through following the developments in the field closely. And diplomatic achievements will require you to be able to act proactively, preventively, and adapting to outbreaking developments. Turkey is the fifth country around the world with the largest diplomatic network, with 252 foreign missions around the world. Not only with our ever-expanding diplomatic network, we also have the Turkish Investment Agency, the Disaster Relief Agency, Yunus Emre Institute, Turkish Marif Foundation, the Turkish Red Crescent, and Turkish Airlines are some of the institutions we are proud to be omnipresent around four corners of the world. With our highly qualified and capable diplomats, we are defending our interests, and we are trying to extend a helping hand to everyone in need around the world in order to contribute to the establishment of peace, prosperity, development, and welfare. And in many regions around the world, we have already started harvesting the fruits of the plants that we had planted.